Our final page of notes for this unit is going to be on the presidency of George H.W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush. And if you remember from earlier this year, we watched the funeral of George Bush. He is the most recent president to die, died just a few months ago. And he was born in 1924, and as I said, just recently died in 2018 at the age of 94. Lived to a very old age and just recently passed away. Now, he was a World War II hero. A lot of our presidents served in World War II. In fact, every president from Eisenhower to Bush served in World War II in some capacity. So he served from 1942 to 1945, and he was the youngest fighter pilot in the entire U.S. Navy. So very decorated and accomplished and brave soldier. He was also from New England, but he moved to Texas when he was an adult and became very wealthy in the oil industry. He was a smart businessman, and afterwards he became involved in politics. One of the first positions he held was the director of the CIA during Nixon's time in office. He later became the ambassador to China, moved to China for a little while with his wife once his kids were grown up. He was also the father of President George W. Bush, who was president when probably all of y'all were born, president during my childhood. And they are one of two father-son president pairs, and the other one is John Adams and his son John Quincy Adams. Also, just kind of a fun fact about him, he was a real thrill seeker when he was alive, even in his old age. And he celebrated his 85th, 90th, and 91st birthdays by skydiving. I can't imagine skydiving now. I'd be too scared to do that. But especially at 91 years old, he was still skydiving. Pretty incredible. He was also president during the very important date of November 10th, 1992. And in case you don't know that date, that is my birthday. That's when I was born. So George Bush was president when I was born. Now, one reason why he became president, a big reason why George H.W. Bush won the presidential election of 1988 is because he was Ronald Reagan's vice president. And at the end of Reagan's 8 years, he was very popular. Reagan was very popular, and a lot of people wanted 4 more years of Reagan's policies. Okay, but not only was Reagan 77 years old, but he also, because of the 22nd Amendment, could not run for a third term, even though he probably would have won. So Reagan endorsed George Bush, and Bush became president. He defeated a guy named Michael Dukakis, who was the governor of Massachusetts. This was really the last landslide victory in an election. He won 40 out of 50 states, so pretty big victory there. Now, a lot of people, when he was running for president, were concerned that Bush would not keep taxes low like Reagan had done during his 8 years, and therefore people were afraid that the economy would not boom as much as it had under Reagan. Since Bush was more of a moderate, whereas Reagan was much more conservative. And so Bush made a very famous promise, and he repeated it over and over and over again during his campaign. His slogan was, "Read my lips, no new taxes." He said if Congress asked him to ever raise taxes, he would say, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And he said that over and over, pretty much every single speech. It got to be where people were chanting it with him while he said it, kind of like how Trump supporters chanted "Make America Great Again" whenever he would say that. This was his big slogan. So voters liked Bush's decisiveness, his very kind personality, a very morally good person. And in 1988, Bush won 40 out of 50 states, as you see on that map. Now, this is the last time that a Republican won several states. It's the last time a Republican ever won California, the last time a Republican ever won some of those New England states, and the last time a Republican had ever won Illinois. Okay, after that, those have all been blue states consistently voting Democrat. So one of the big things he had to face during his time as president, which we briefly talked about last class, was the Tiananmen Square riot. So after Mao Zedong's death in 1976, the future of China was very unclear. A very large percentage of the country did not want communism anymore. They wanted China to become a democracy again and have freedom like their parents had before Mao Zedong. So in 1989, there was a student-led protest march over the lack of political freedom in China, and the lack of progress, really, that had been made after Mao's death. After Mao died, a lot of people said that things should get better We should get more political freedom, more civil rights, more human rights, things like that. But it just didn't happen because Mao's successors were pretty strict like he was. And this protest turned violent when Chinese troops with tanks, they were armed with tanks and assault rifles, were sent into Tiananmen Square to break up this riot and opened fire into the group of civilians. And nearly 1,000 civilians were killed in the streets. There on the bottom, you see a famous picture. You can even look up video footage of this. You have one man standing in front of the tanks. He wouldn't let them pass. Eventually, I believe he was killed too. All right, so this really showed us that while the Cold War was coming to an end, still communism is a threat worldwide, at least to its own people. So communism at the end of the Cold War is no longer a threat to the United States or the West, but we see here with the Tiananmen Square riots, and it's still the case today, that communism still does exist and still oppresses its own people within the countries it exists. Right? Another crisis that occurred in foreign policy was the invasion of Iraq. All right, so Iraq in August of 1990, led by Saddam Hussein, they invaded the small country of Kuwait. They annexed it under their control. So if you look at this map here, here is Iraq, and they invaded Kuwait to take its oil. And this is a very small country right along the Persian Gulf. And whenever in this post-World War II era, when we see one foreign country invading another foreign country to take it over, it reminds us a lot of Adolf Hitler. And remember, with Hitler, we appeased him, and that led to World War II. So we said we cannot appease totalitarians anymore. So we saw this guy, Saddam Hussein, who was terrible to his own people, who eventually we found out actually committed genocide against both the Kurdish Muslims in the northern part of Iraq and also the Marsh Arabs in the southern part of Iraq, killed tens of thousands of his own people. He was very much a fascist, very similar to what Hitler was. So we did not want him to get away with invading Kuwait. So the U.S. led a coalition of 35 countries, invaded Kuwait in order to push out the Iraqi troops. So this military conflict became known as the Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War, and it had two components. First was Operation Desert Shield, and this was from August of 1990 to January of 91, and this was the preliminary phase to build up troops and defense in Saudi Arabia. And then came Operation Desert Storm, just lasted about 2 months, and that was the actual combat mission. Now, in less than 6 weeks, the U.S. was able to push the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait completely. This was very fast, very effective, and this military operation resulted in less than 300 American deaths, but about 30,000 Iraqi deaths. All right, so very favorable kill ratio for the American troops. This is one of the shortest wars in all of history. All right, whenever wars start, people always say, oh, this is going to be a really short war, it'll be over soon. All right, that happened with the Revolutionary War, happened with the Civil War, happened with the World Wars, and then they turned out to be very long and bloody events. This war was very short, and the U.S. was able to attain victory very quickly. But one decision that Bush made after we pushed out the Iraqis is something that has been debated by historians as whether or not it was a good decision. Once we pushed Hussein and the Iraqis out of Kuwait, Bush chose not to extend the fighting into Iraq, but he proclaimed mission accomplished. He said, hey, it was our goal to push him out of Kuwait. Now he's back in his own country, and we'll let him stay there. Some people said that we should have pushed into Iraq after liberating Kuwait in order to dethrone the fascist dictator Saddam Hussein. That way, if we had done that, it's very possible that the Iraq War of the 2000s wouldn't have been as necessary. Okay, so that's something that can be debated historically, whether or not we did the right thing by stopping once we pushed the Iraqis out of Kuwait. So the leaders during the Gulf War, of course, George H.W. Bush was president, a very fast and decisive victory, and this is seen as his greatest accomplishment in office. He was much more of a foreign policy president, more so than a domestic policy president. The general who led the U.S. forces in Kuwait, his name was Norman Schwarzkopf. He had the nickname Stormin' Norman, and he was the general, the head general, and then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was Colin Powell, and we've learned about him before. Remember, he fought in Vietnam. He served as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Bush. He was Secretary of Defense under Reagan. He was Secretary of State under George W. Bush, a very accomplished and decorated war hero. So while things went pretty well as far as foreign policy during Bush's economy, all of a sudden in the early 1990s, the economy started to falter. After a decade of prosperity under Reagan's policies, the economy started to very rapidly decline, and people started to panic. They said, oh no, this is going to be just like in the 1970s under Ford and Carter, where we're going to have so much inflation and we're going to have gas lines again. This is just going to be terrible. And President Bush had to decide, how are we going to fix this? How are we going to get more money flowing to the American people, to the government, in order to fix this problem? So after much deliberation, President Bush decided he had no other choice but to raise taxes. Now, lots of presidents have raised taxes. A lot of times that's seen as no big deal. Presidents lower taxes sometimes, raise taxes sometimes, and that's just what happens. But the reason why this was such a big deal, why Bush raising taxes was such a big deal, is because this went against his very well-known campaign promise, no new taxes. So this really hurt him in the 1992 election, because his opponent, Bill Clinton, kind of exploited this and said, hey, George Bush lied. Okay? He lied in his campaign. He said no new taxes, and then once the economy turned bad, he raised taxes. So this really hurt him in his election in 1992 when he was trying to get reelected against Bill Clinton. So Bill Clinton was the governor of Arkansas at the time. He was an underdog in the Democratic primaries at first, since he wasn't a Washington insider. He was in the state government of Arkansas, but he won the New Hampshire primary and then very, very soon became the front runner. And he was nicknamed the comeback kid because no one thought that he could do it, and since he was relatively young. So he was young, he was charismatic, great personality, and in a lot of ways very similar to John F. Kennedy in the 1960 election. Just had a very cool vibe, and people were attracted to that kind of personality. So during the 1992 election campaign, one area where Bill Clinton decisively outperformed President Bush was in the debates. Okay, so TV debates have been a thing ever since 1960 with Nixon and Kennedy. But in these debates, Clinton did a much better job than Bush did. Okay, so Bush, he's the president of the United States, he's a busy guy, and he appeared very distracted and kind of disengaged with the people who were asking questions, whereas Clinton appeared very youthful, very decisive, and most of all, he appeared compassionate. So if you look at the picture up here, the person in the audience who's asking these guys a question, Bill Clinton, he's leaning in, he's listening, he's making eye contact. As you see here, President Bush is standing up and checking his watch, all right? So even though he probably did care about what that person said, the optics of that are just so bad, it looks like he doesn't care. So this really hurt him in the debates because he did not look as compassionate, and also because he broke his campaign promise of no new taxes. So this resulted in Bill Clinton defeating Bush, making Bush a one-term president, the last one-term president we have ever had. Now, Clinton would later on lead the country for 2 terms, bringing the U.S. into the 21st century. And next unit, he is the first president we will talk about in our last unit coming up.